gang violence. Many Haitians are looking to flee the country. Secretary Kerry, as the Biden administration focuses on the root cause of migration, can you describe how taking action on climate crisis can help bring stability to our nations and other nations where their citizens are looking to migrate?
Thank you so much for that thoughtful question, and it's really a major, major problem because there are now climate refugees already today who are moving across borders and looking for different places to live. Some of the people, not all of them, but some of the folks coming from Central America and South America fit into that category. There are folks who used to farm who now find they can't farm the products, the goods that they were farming, and so they're migrating. And one of the things that we learned during the course of the war in Syria was 1 million people moved into Damascus, which greatly complicated the war, but then they began to migrate and became a political tool, actually, and were sort of pushed to migrate into Europe and had a profound impact, a negative one, on the politics of Europe as a result. So this is a major issue, and it's one we have to really pay attention to.
Secretary, I wanted to ask you one question before we end, which is imperative. In April, Fort Lauderdale, which is in my district, witnessed unprecedented flash flood caused by the highest record rainfall in one single day. The flooding resulted in significant property damage, the closure of the airport, and shortages of gas all across South Florida. Recently, ocean temperatures in Florida Keys soared to 96 degrees, highlighting the impact of the rising temperatures on the region's marine ecosystem. Can you explain to us why this is happening and what is causing the increased weather and extreme weather, since there are people who don't believe in climate change?
Well, thank you again. I just might point out that I just saw this article this morning that Farmers Insurance has pulled out of Florida, affecting 100,000 policyholders. And the reason the insurance company has pulled out is because this unprecedented change in weather patterns, et cetera, has affected their ability to be able to make policies and for people to be able to afford those policies under the current circumstances. This has been a predicted happening. I mean, everybody's been talking about the potential impact on insurance, and now it is happening in various parts of the world. So, I mean, the reason, as I said earlier, 90% of the heating of the planet, which is documented, goes into the ocean. And that warming of the ocean then increases the moisture that rises from the ocean and travels around the planet with the planetary winds. And when it decides to fall in rainfall, it goes into the it is in much larger amounts than ever before because of the increase of the moisture. It's changed wind patterns and weather patterns, and the heating has other ancillary effects.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Issa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, it's a pleasure seeing you. It's a pleasure knowing that you're in this administration. And I mean that quite sincerely. I'm often disappointed in this administration. I'm not necessarily in lockstep with all of your opinions, but you and I go back a long way of trying to do the right thing. First of all, I wanted to get a figure you gave that I may have miswritten. You predicted, you didn't give the amount they have today, but you predicted 2,200 gigawatts in China by 2030. Is that accurate?
That's what our current estimates are showing. This comes from a number of different sources, but it could be more, it could be less.
But today, how many gig do they have, roughly?
Let me get back to you. I was actually talking with folks about that yesterday, and I couldn't get it pinned down, but I'll come back to you with a number.
Okay, yeah, it'd be good for me to have that because that's a lofty goal, but as you and I both know, you go to China, you see a lot of amazing cranes, but then when you go back, you see the cranes in the same position. So it doesn't always mean that they're doing what they say they're going to do. In 2021, you said that you told this committee that trusting China in climate change promises would be stupid and malpractice. without directly using that quote again, would you generally agree that it still would be malpractice?
I think trusting a lot of the players who've been involved in this, in government and also private sector, is not the smartest thing in the world because we've been burned.
Now, China is a country that buys all of the above, no question at all. They buy a massive amount of ours and the rest of the world's coal. They're increasing their coal. They're buying natural gas. They're putting in nuclear. And as you said, they're doing some work, considerable work in the photovoltaic that they produce. But India has a tendency to continue burning both dung and coal. You're going to China, but we had the head of India here for a joint session just recently, and he said a lot of great things, but he didn't say we're going to buy natural gas or do other incremental things to reduce the carbon footprint. Are we dealing with two problems, a China that it's malpractice to believe that they'll do what they say they'll do, and an India that constantly seems to say they're too poor to do what they should do to do any part of climate change reduction?
Well, interestingly, Congressman, and thank you for your comments, we have enjoyed working together on a number of things. India has set a very lofty goal of trying to deploy 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. That's their goal. And if India could succeed in doing that, India would be in compliance with the effort to keep, that would be a 1.5 degree plan. That would be really
and I understand that, Mr. Secretary, but if, for example, if India had simply switched its coal production to natural gas, they would have reduced more than that amount, and they would have done so at a lower cost. So isn't it fair to say that India sets lofty goals like China, but actions speak louder than words? So far, their actions.
Well, India is deploying. They're deploying. Their hope is to deploy, and their hope is to close coal. Now, they can't afford. They don't have LNG, and they.
Well, they don't have LNG because they haven't built the plants or signed the contract.
Well, that is true. But on the other hand, they can't afford to do that on their own. They weren't able to at that point in time. India is growing now. Its economy is growing. The visit here produced some significant joint initiatives going forward. I am actually going to India before the end of this month to follow up on the conversations we had with both the Prime Minister being here, but also before that with some of his other.
Okay, and if I can squeeze in one more quick question. You're going to meet in China with a number of leaders, but the president Xi Jinping called him a dictator. Do you believe he wields the power of a dictator today in China? Meaning, is his ability is similar to Putin's ability to affect what he says he will do, such that if he makes a promise, he can keep it?
There's no question at all that President Xi is the major decider of the direction and of the policies of
Is he
China.
in fact effectively a dictator?
Well, I'm not. I don't think it's useful to get into. I'm not going to get into.
But he does wield the power of.
He wields enormous power as the leader of China, absolutely, and everybody understands that. But I don't. It doesn't.
Do you wish the president had used another word?
No, I don't even. I just, frankly, all of that is sort of like water off the duck's back, and I don't think we ought to get tangled up in, labels and names and whatever. What we ought to do is look at the heart of what we're trying to do. President Biden actually has a very good relationship with President Xi, and President Xi vice versa. I think he honors the relationship he has with President Biden, and I think in Secretary Blinken's visit to China, and subsequently in Janet Yellen's visit with China, where you saw in her own statements publicly and assessments, there was frank conversation. But the effort is well underway now to try to stabilize and avoid conflict by virtue of unforeseen consequences or mistakes.
Chair now recognizes.
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask one follow-up? It doesn't require, but would you commit, when you have had those meetings with India and China, to in writing or in some other way, report back to us so we have an update on the
Sure,
Mexico's.
be happy to.
I thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. Chair now recognizes Ms. Titus for 5 minutes.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you go towards the end, there are not many questions left to ask, but you have the luxury of having heard everything gone before and kind of reached some conclusions. One thing I heard was my colleague on the other side called the secretary, most of the scientists in the world, and the heads of 195 countries who belong to the UN climate agreement grifters. Now, that's something that should be taken down, but since he's gone in his typical hit-and-run fashion, it wouldn't be much point. Now, the arguments that I've heard from both sides, on the other side of the aisle, we hear you can't make China do anything. You can't force China to do anything. You can't impose any restrictions on China. Therefore, we shouldn't be doing anything in the United States. On the other hand, when you're getting ready to go to China and try to negotiate something or make some points or try to influence their decision, they don't want you to go. They think that's not a good idea. Also, we hear that you have a pro-China, not a pro-American approach, and you are not helping U.S. business and workers. On the other hand, these people who are saying this voted against the Inflation Reduction Act, which made a big investment in manufacturing and workers and solar energy panels that we don't have to get from the Uyghurs, but can be made here. Speaking of the Uyghurs, there's a real now sudden interest in human rights of the Uyghurs, but it doesn't bother them too much to deal with Saudi Arabia when it comes to these issues. Also, we know that this is a world issue. Climate change affects everything from demographics to politics to economics, and yet we're not looking at the rest of the world. It's as though only the U.S. and China exist on the globe. So I would ask you, Mr. Secretary, because climate change and energy policy is so pervasive in everything we do, it's not just about dealing with the next storm or the next wildfire. It has so much of an impact on peacekeeping, on development of foreign countries, on our role internationally. Are what you're hearing from the other side diminishing our influence, hurting our role as we try to kind of move back into being an international leader, kind of upsetting some of our NATO relations because of what Europe is doing and what we're not? Are the cuts in the budget going to make a difference because we can't now invest what the president would like to see us do to help the rest of the world with these global problems? Would you just address that sort of thing for us?
Well, Congresswoman, thank you very much. Let me just say I got the figures delivered to me here, and I'll take 15 seconds on this. China, according to the International Energy Agency, by 2030, China will have somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 gigawatts of renewable energy. That's by fathoms larger than any other country in the planet. And so they're moving very aggressively in that regard. With respect to look, people really do count on America for a lot of things in the world. And I think everyone should be extraordinarily proud of our history of doing things. We're the largest humanitarian donor in the world. And you look at what we've done with AIDS in Africa or Ebola or, through various counterterrorism efforts, other things. But we also, for a long period of time, projected, and this is sort of the soft power projection, but we also, we helped people develop. We helped people do more. That's been retreating in the last years. We're now giving less than a lot of other countries are doing in order to help, particularly on climate. And I think it does have an impact. I think that people ask questions. I certainly hear these questions. Why aren't you doing that? Why aren't you more present? Why aren't you? Look at who's giving us help here, and so forth. So I think that, you can't just sit there anywhere and wish that things are going to be as they have been historically, you have to invest in it. You have to actually proactively have people on the ground. You have to build relationships. You have to do things that people see you doing, not just on an economic competitive basis, but because it's the right thing to do. And I think we've fallen a little behind on that. I know President Biden feels very strongly about living up to our commitments and our values.
Thank you very much. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. Chair now recognizes Mr. Waltz for 5 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, in an exchange with Mr. Mills, you just testified under oath that you never owned a private jet. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record an article here from February 15th of 2023 that the John Kerry family private jet was sold shortly after accusations of climate hypocrisy. Mr. Secretary, do you stand by that testimony
Without
that
objection.
you've never owned or
I personally,
your family?
I
by your family?
personally, yes, my wife owned a plane and she sold the
You
plane.
flew on
That's
that plane?
Not in a number of years, but I have flown on it,
And
sure.
this article is not then inaccurate, that your family owned a plane, you flew on a plane.
My
Mr.
wife
Secretary,
owned
here's
the plane.
here's the issue.
Yeah.
This isn't some kind of partisan gotcha. When we are asking Americans to make serious sacrifices as we transition for the common good, and your family and or yourself are flying around on private jets, that smacks of hypocrisy. It actually hurts your cause, Mr. Secretary. But I'll move on. I just want to know from a record standpoint.
Afford me the right, at least, to set the record straight here. I do not fly on a private jet. I do not fly. I fly commercially.
Have you
on
flown
all
on a
of my
private jet since you've
responsibilities.
taken this position?
Just let me finish. I have flown 5 times in the last 2.5 years on Millair, which you also fly on,
Sure.
and or some of you who travel fly on 5 times. Otherwise, all of my trips are commercial
Have you
airlines.
flown on a private jet in a personal or official capacity since you've taken this position?
Possibly once. I don't. I think. I just don't. I'm trying to think. Of the
I
date.
think you need to take the broader point of how this appears to the American people
But no,
as
it
we're asking them
shouldn't
to
appear
take
that. Let
that.
me tell you why.
We're
We're not asking
these
Americans.
testimonies.
We're not asking Americans not to fly.
You know,
You're trying to create an unequal thing. We're
no,
not saying
we're asking
don't
you
fly.
to lead by example, Mr. Secretary. That's what we're at. You,
Which is
your
why I
family,
fly
and others to lead
commercially.
by example.
Which is why I
Mr.
fly.
In that
commercially.
vein, does your office or the State Department keep a record of your official travel and scheduled meetings?
Of course.
Does that include the individuals you're scheduled to meet with?
I,
Can you provide those records to Congress? Will you provide those records to Congress?
of who I've met with.
Your official travel, taxpayer funded while in this position.
Sure, happy to do so.
Thank you. I appreciate that commitment. Switching topics here to some of the other diplomacy you've conducted. In a 2018 interview, you admitted to speaking with Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, quote, 3 or 4 times from the start of the previous administration. How many times did you speak with the foreign minister, the Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, during the last administration? And I'll enter into the record, Mr. Chairman,
Without objection.
that 3 or 4 times. So let's take that at face value. Did you communicate with him using Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, any other?
I don't recall how I communicated with him. I met him formally in the course of international, specifically I think it was at UNGA in New York. I saw him in Munich at the Munich Security Conference, which he was invited to.
According to
I
leaked
saw him.
According to leaked audio provided by the New York Times, Zarif said you told him that Israel attacked Iranian assets in Syria at least, quote, at least 200 times, and Zarif was surprised you would reveal such sensitive information. Now, that was according to leaked audio. Now, under oath, do you stand by your previous denial that ever happened?
I absolutely stand by. On the day that report came out, we made it crystal clear in a release that we put out that never took place. It was at a time when there was public discussion of those attacks. It was in public circulation. Now, I don't know what he's confusing or what he did, but I can tell you that I never had that conversation, and I can tell you that in 5 years running one of the largest prosecutor's offices in America, in 2 years as lieutenant governor, in 28 years in the Senate, as a member of the Intelligence Committee, as a
This is why I'm going. I
Secretary
only
of
have a few
State,
seconds left.
nobody ever
Secretary.
questioned.
This is why I'm raising that issue. Would you find it appropriate if a former Trump administration official traveled around and talked to the same officials you are and said, you don't have to abide by these agreements, hold fast till 2024, a new regime or a new administration may be coming in, and therefore undermining current administration diplomacy?
No,
Would you find that appropriate?
I'm not going to speak to any hypotheticals, but I can tell you I never engaged in that.
Shadow diplomacy undermines American goals.
Shadow diplomacy, depending on what involved. Shadow diplomacy has also saved us from a war. If you look at 1963 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was behind the scenes, back
Mr.
channel
Secretary,
conversation.
I would posture that your shadow diplomacy now has us on the verge
I wasn't
of Iran
conducting
having
shadow
a nuclear
diplomacy.
weapon.
I was at a security
That
conference.
is now exploding as they race towards full enrichment from 20% to 60%, on the verge of having a nuclear weapon and a nuclear arms race in the Middle East.
And the reason that has
As
happened is that
Americans,
Donald Trump pulled out of the
undermine
agreement.
other administrations.
The reason that happened, my friend, is because Donald Trump pulled out of that agreement. There was no way they could have had a nuclear weapon under the agreement that existed. And even in Israel, the security establishment of Israel believed that agreement had done the job. President Trump just pulled out.
Chair now
Gave it away.
recognizes Mr. Schneider for 5 minutes.